Hi everyone. Welcome to our talk about hacking the supply chain, the Ripple20 vulnerabilities that hundreds of millions of devices. A little about who we are. JSOF is a software security consultancy. We do security research, penetration testing, consulting on secure development, as well as some training. My name is Shlomi Oberman. I'm a co-founder at JSOF. Together with me will be speaking Moshe, a security researcher at JSOF and the finder of the Ripple20 vulnerabilities, and Ariel Schön, a security researcher at JSOF, also heavily involved in the research. Today we'll be talking about what Ripple20 is, and then diving in detail into one of the vulnerabilities, CVE 2020-11901. After that, we'll be showing some of the details about exploitation of CVE 2020-11901 and a demo of exploitation on a vulnerable device. So, Ripple20. Ripple20 is a series of 19 zero-day vulnerabilities in a TCP IP stack called Treck TCP IP. 19 vulnerabilities, give or take. 2 of these vulnerabilities were actually reported anonymously at the same time as we reported, and actually resulted in 24 patches altogether. So, depends how you count. These vulnerabilities were amplified by the supply chain, something that we'll be talking about and showing, to affect hundreds of millions of devices across a wide range of verticals, pretty much any type of IoT device you can think about. Out of these vulnerabilities, 4 of the vulnerabilities are critical remote code execution vulnerabilities. This is not necessarily according to the CVSS, but according to our assessment of the vulnerabilities, but 4 of them are also critical CVSS. 8 of the vulnerabilities are medium to high severity vulnerabilities with some chance of remote code execution and other effects. The devices affected are made by vendors you all know. Large vendors, devices of high impact, as well as smaller vendors. Vendors really range from all types of IoT devices, and from Fortune 500 companies to one-person shops, tiny little companies making embedded specialist devices. The types of devices you can encounter in your hospital, at home, or in your network, power, water, cellular utilities, things you use in your everyday life, transportation. Pretty much anything we do is powered by devices affected by Ripple20 vulnerabilities. At this stage, knowing what we know about affected devices and affected vulnerabilities, we're assuming every mid to large organization in the US has at least one vulnerable device, whether it be a networking device, a printing device, ICS device, etc. Why did this happen? So it all has to do with the supply chain. Somebody takes a piece of source code, a library, and embeds it into a larger component, say an operating system. This component then gets embedded further in a system on module or a larger component, which then once again gets embedded into a larger component, and so on and so forth until we reach our final product. At a certain moment in the supply chain, nobody knows they're using the original library. Nobody knows they're using this original source code. Just imagine what happens if one of the components along the way, one of the companies along the way goes bankrupt or ceases operation, how difficult it is to fix these vulnerabilities. And so with this supply chain, we have a network of devices that embed different components beginning at a single library, a single piece of source code. And if a vulnerability exists in a certain library at the beginning of the supply chain, this vulnerability infects the other parts of the network, kind of like a plague, and the vulnerability travels from one device to the other device, reaching all kinds of different areas in the supply chain, reaching different types of devices. This is what happened with Ripple20, a vulnerability deep in the supply chain that affected other devices, affected more and more devices as this piece of code traveled. Why we chose Treck TCP IP and why we think this research is interesting for the community and for the listeners. Well, the first issue is the issue of supply chain. Not in the sense that somebody put a backdoor in your supply chain, in the sense that one vulnerability in a single piece of code travels across the supply chain. So one vulnerability, multiple products. Multiple products, a few dozen different vendors, a few hundreds of different types of products. Extremely large IoT impact, and the potential for zombie vulnerabilities. Zombie vulnerabilities, these vulnerabilities, we're not exactly sure whether to call them 1 days or 0 days, because we've already reported them but probably not going to be fixed in some of these devices where the company went bankrupt, chose not to fix, the supply chain is too complex to follow, etc. And of course, a good attack surface, TCP/IP, mostly unauthenticated, a lot of parsing, pretty old code, the perfect attack candidate. A little bit about the concrete, specific TCP/IP stack that we chose. Treck TCP/IP, pretty successful TCP/IP stack, one of the leading TCP/IP stacks, at least for a while. Treck is a small American company that makes TCP/IP stack, a fully featured TCP/IP stack, going all the way from the link layer to application layer protocols, complete with all the RFCs needed to be implemented, and has been available for over 20 years. Usually used in embedded devices and real-time operating systems, and very importantly for our research, very, very configurable. So each instance of the Treck stack, each device implementing the Treck stack has a slightly different version of Treck. And this affected a lot of the vulnerabilities and a lot of the way we did our research. This happens because different vendors compile the Treck stack differently, and because they use different versions of Treck, and then sometimes stop support. And most importantly, it's strategically located at the very beginning of an extremely long supply chain. So in some cases, we've seen companies that are second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand users of Treck and had no idea they were using this piece of code. A little bit about how we conducted our research. So because every piece of Treck TCP/IP stack is different, every instance is different, we took 6 data points, 6 different devices, and reverse engineered them in multiple versions. We didn't spend as much effort on every one of the devices, the same amount of effort on all the devices, but we used these in order to understand the situation better, understand how the vulnerabilities change over time. Every one of our devices had different configuration, a different version. The research took approximately 9 months with different levels of intensity, starting September 19th, ending sometime around June 20th with the public disclosure. And the research involved a few strange architectures, a few strange firmwares. We'll be talking about one of them today. Unfortunately, we can't go into all the details today. We only have 35 minutes, but we did release 2 white papers detailing full technical details of several of the vulnerabilities, as well as exploitation. You're welcome to look them up on our website. Today we're going to be talking mostly about a single CVE, which is the CVE we find most interesting and perhaps the most critical of the Ripple20 vulnerabilities. It's a vulnerability, a client-side vulnerability in Treck's DNS resolver component. It can result in remote code execution, and we've demonstrated this. And the interesting thing about it is that because DNS will travel from inside your corporate network to the internet, a sophisticated attacker can potentially use this to attack a device from outside network boundaries. Another interesting thing is, because the Treck TCP/IP stack is so configurable, this one CV actually hides 4 vulnerabilities and one, what we're calling an artifact, a bug that makes it easier for us to exploit. Different versions of the Treck, different vendors have different versions of the vulnerabilities. All of them have a remote code execution in this case, but just an example of how complex this really is. Today we'll be talking about 3 of these vulnerabilities and the artifact. Now I'm going to hand over the microphone to Moshe Kol, who is going to be discussing the vulnerabilities in detail.
Hi, I'm Moshe, security researcher at JSOF, and I will be talking about 3 of the vulnerabilities that comprise CVE 2020-11901, also known as the DNS bugs. So, as Shlomi said, the vulnerability is found in the DNS resolver component of Treck TCP/IP, and we will need to refresh our memory about the basics of the DNS protocol. So, DNS is a core internet protocol designed to map between domain names and IP addresses. It's a query response protocol, client-server architecture. So the client resolves the name by issuing a query to a DNS server. So if, for example, you browse to www.example.com, your browser issues a DNS query of type A to one of the configured DNS servers, and the DNS server looks up the name and returns a response. Each response has a value. For type A, the value is an IPv4 address. DNS servers can return multiple answers in the same DNS response. And an answer is specified as a resource record, which consists of the following fields according to the RFC. The name specifies the name to which this record refers. Each record has a type. We talk about the type shortly. A class field, which in practice is always constant. A TTL field, which specifies the number of seconds this record is valid. The value is specified in the RData field, whose length is specified in the RDLENGTH field. So both questions and answers have a type. Some of the common type includes type A, which we saw before, specifies an IPv4 address for the query domain. Type CNAME, which defines an alias, a canonical name for the query domain. And type MX, that specifies a domain name of a mail server for the query domain. So if you send an email to gmail.com, your mail client issues a DNS query of type MX and gets back a domain name of a mail server for gmail.com. And because this is a name, this name needs to be resolved into an IP address. So a second DNS query of type A in this case is generated by the client. In practice, most DNS servers simply hand in type A records in the first DNS response to reduce latency, but nonetheless, this functionality should be supported by DNS resolvers. So a little bit about domain names encoding. So domain names are encoded as a sequence of labels. So www is a label, example is a label. Each label is preceded by a length byte, which specifies the number of characters this label occupies, and the name is terminated with a 0 length byte. And according to the RFC, the maximum label length is 63. This will come up later. So what the designers of the DNS protocol notice is that there is a lot of repetition in a single DNS packet. So to reduce the size of the DNS messages, they simply employ a compression scheme. In this scheme, compression is achieved by replacing a sequence of labels with a pointer to prior occurrence of the same sequence. So you can see a sample DNS response packet of type MX for gmail.com. You can see gmail.com is specified literally in the packet in offset hex C from the start. And it so happens that gmail.com need to be specified additional times in the packet. So instead of specifying gmail.com literally, we will use the compression scheme. We replace it with a pointer to the offset from the start of the header where it is written. So if you want to write smtp.gmail.com, we only need to write smtp, the first label literally, and the next two labels are specified using the compression pointer. So in this scheme, compression pointers are encoded in 2 bytes. The first byte begins with 1, as most significant bits, and the other 14 bits specify an offset from the start of the header. So we found the 3 vulnerabilities in the DNS parsing logic of Treck TCP IP, specifically in the function tfDNS callback, which is responsible for the parsing. And here you can see a pseudocode of this function responsible for parsing MX resource records. So we can see that the length of the MX hostname is calculated by the function expand label length. Based on that length, a buffer is allocated on the heap. And then label to ASCII copies the MX hostname as ASCII to the previously allocated buffer, pointed to by ASCII PTR in the snippet. And what we can see is that label to ASCII is not aware of the length of the allocated buffer. This means that if for some reason expand label length returns a length value which is too small, then label to ASCII will overflow the buffer because it simply copies bytes until a null byte is reached. So this motivates us to look further into expand label length. So this is a pseudocode for expand label length. What this function is basically doing is sums up all the length bytes while honoring compression. So in more details, it reads the current label length. It then checks to see if there is compression or not. If there is no compression, which is the common case, it adds the current label length plus 1 to the total length variable, which is later returned from this function, and advances the input head. If there is compression, it reads the compression offset, computes a new label pointer based on that offset, and then checks to see that the new label PTR points before the initial label pointer. This means we can only jump backwards, and we cannot jump forward. This will come up later. And the length calculation continues from the new label pointer. So as you can see, expand label length is not aware of the bounds of the packet buffer. This led us to the first vulnerability, a read out of bounds vulnerability. So this vulnerability could result in a denial of service if, for example, while iterating over the length byte, we read from an unmapped page. But more interestingly, it can lead to an info leak. So TF-DNS label to ASCII, the function that does the copying, has no bound checks either. This means that data from the heap could be interpreted as an MX hostname. This MX hostname is later resolved by the client in an attempt to get an IP address. So this means that data is leaked inside the MX hostname itself. So this vulnerability affects Treck version at least 4.7 and was fixed in later versions. As we see, we don't know the exact date they fixed the vulnerability, but nonetheless, the vulnerability still found in the wild due to the complex supply chain effect. So some vendors don't receive support from Treck or don't apply patches. And some devices don't even have the means to update themselves. So still something to worry about. And this is nice and all, but we are looking for an RCE. So let's go back to the function that calculates the length and examine its operation. There are more issues with it. So there is a limitation on the maximum, on the length of the domain name. The limitation, according to the RFC, is 255 characters, and this limitation is not enforced. Expand label length further does not validate that the characters of the domain name, they should be alphanumeric and hyphen only, but it doesn't validate the characters. And most importantly, the total length variable is stored as an unsigned short, 16-bit width, and this is also the return value of expand label length. So we will try to get our RCE by overflowing the total length variable. So in order to pull this thing off, we need to construct a name whose length is larger than 64K. And we wondered, is it really possible? Can we do this? Can we overflow the total length variable within a single DNS response packet? And the answer is yes. We use the DNS compression feature to achieve this. The idea was to nest compression pointers within themselves. So recall that expand label length does not validate the characters of the domain name. This means we can embed inside the name itself any bytes we want. And in this case, we chose compression pointers, as we will see in the example shortly. Keep in mind during the examples that we have two challenges to overcome. First, there is a limitation on the size of the DNS response packet. The maximum size allowed is 1460 bytes over UDP. And keep in mind that we can only jump backwards from our current label pointer, so we need to overcome this challenge also. So what you see in front of you is the basic construction we used in order to overflow the total length variable. You can see a name arranged in the matrix-like form. Each row in the matrix has length 16. Bluish cells represent compression pointers, and pink cells represent branch bytes. Talk about those shortly. So let's assume that we start expanding the name from this spot. That is calculating the length. We can actually achieve this in practice by using another compression pointer that will land us exactly in that spot, but for now, take it as a given. So if we start expanding the length from this byte, what expand label length does, it checks to see if there is compression or not. There is no compression in this case, so we simply add 0f plus 1 bytes to the total length variable and skip 0f plus 1. Because the matrix is arranged in this special matrix form, we simply move to the next row and stay in the same column. So the process repeats until we reach a branch byte. For this value of the purpose of the branch byte is to lead us to the next compression pointer. For this value of the branch byte, we will land on this compression pointer. we can tell that it is compression pointer because the high nibble of the first byte is C. And at this point, we read the compression offset. In this case, it's 0E, which points before our initial label pointer, our initial offset that was 0F. So we pass the check that we can only jump backward, and we continue expanding from this spot. The process continues. We reach a branch byte. We land in another compression pointer. And you can see that the total length value nearly doubles itself after we did this compression trick. So we simply continue expanding the name until the null byte is reached. You can see that the total length value in this toy example turned out to be 1502 bytes, which is pretty neat if you consider the fact that the name only occupies 128 bytes. So this, of course, doesn't overflow the total length variable yet, but when we use the maximum label length allowed of x3f, instead of xf shown in the example, we reached, using this construction, a name whose length is greater than 64K, thus overflowing the total length variable. And recall that if expand label length returns a value which is too small than the actual value, we have an heap-based buffer overflow. So this is a good RCE candidate. And it's important to note that this vulnerability can be triggered in response to every query type supported by the network stack by using CNAME resource records, which must be parsed in every DNS response. And this vulnerability affects the latest Treck version at the time of disclosure. So we were pretty happy about it at this stage. And we purchased a new device, a Schneider Electric UPS device at this point. And we wanted to know if the vulnerabilities affect this UPS device. And what we saw is that Treck fixes the read out of bound vulnerability, which means the UPS device has a slightly newer version of Treck than the one we examined. You can see that the RDLENGTH value is checked against the remaining size of the packet. And now expand label length accepts a third argument, label NPTR, which is calculated based on the RDLENGTH value. So what expand label length does when it reaches label NPTR, it simply stops processing without any error and returns the current total length. This is perfect from an attacker standpoint because RDLENGTH is attacker controlled. So if we can specify a value which is smaller than the actual RDLENGTH value, there is a chance that expand label length returns a value which is too small. So here, for example, you can see a resource record. So instead of specifying 20 as the RDLENGTH, we specify 7, and label NPTR will point here in this case. But expand label length returns 5, and TF-DNS label to ASCII will copy the entire MX hostname, thus overflowing our buffer. So another artifact we found during our research is that we can leak another infrastructure during the MX parsing logic. So you can see here another infrastructure is allocated, and in these two error flows, it is not freed. So this means we have two ways to leak another infrastructure. First, by specifying an RDLENGTH value which is smaller than 2, like 1, or by causing expand label length to return a length of 0. And we can do this by using a bad compression pointer, for example. So the size of the leak is hex 3C, and these leaks come in handy when exploiting heap vulnerabilities. And in fact, we use the exact same memory leak in our exploit, as you will see later. So to summarize, CVE 2020-11901 is comprised of 4 vulnerabilities. We talk about 3 of them and 1 artifact. So the first vulnerability, readouts of bound vulnerability, affects older versions of the stack, but was fixed in later versions. As we saw, the integer overflow vulnerability affects both old and newer versions of the stack. The bad RDLENGTH vulnerability is a result from a bad fix for the readouts of bound vulnerability, so it affects only newer versions of the stack, and the artifact is present in both old and newer versions of the stack. So the main takeaway from this part is that a device can be affected by one or more vulnerabilities depending on the exact version of Treck they use, and this fragmentation causes IT security personnel this fragmentation makes the life of the IT security personnel more challenging to know whether their devices are affected or not. So now I'll hand over the mic to Ariel Schön. He will talk about exploitation.
Thanks, Moshe. Hi, I'm Ariel. I'm also a security researcher at JSOF. And today I'm going to talk about exploitation, specifically exploiting one of the vulnerabilities Moshe talked about on a Schneider Electric UPS device. So a UPS essentially stands for uninterruptible power supply. It's a big battery connected to the wall, and you plug all sorts of devices into it that you don't want them to suffer from power outages or power fluctuations, such as medical devices, critical infrastructure, server racks, stuff like that. So we exploit on a UPS made by Schneider, specifically on the network card. The network card houses a Turbo 186 processor. It's an x86 based processor. All code runs in 16-bit real mode, so OS, Treck, app, whatever, everything. Meaning also that it has basically no modern mitigation, so no ASLR, no DEP, making our life a bit easier. One quirk that this processor is different from x86 is that it shifts the segment register by 8 bits instead of 4 bits, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. And during our research, we had essentially no debugging capabilities, so we focused mainly on static analysis and reverse engineering, and we also had a little bit of assistance from partial crash dumps, including a stack trace and some registers. So just to recap the vulnerability, our primitive is a heap overflow through DNS response parsing. Because this is a slightly newer version of Treck, we can only overflow with alphanumeric characters and hyphens. We chose to exploit on this device using the bad RDLENGTH vulnerability. So we can overflow through all DNS response types, as Moshe said earlier, so whether they be CNAME, A, MX, PTR, all response types. But we chose to overflow specifically through MX, because when the device boots up, the network card will send out 3 MX requests to notify about some events via email. And this is very advantageous from an exploitation point of view, because we would like as much interactivity as possible in our exploit to allow easier heap shaping. We don't care a lot that we need to crash the device in order for this to happen, since we probably need to get the heap into a relatively deterministic state anyway, having no debugging capability, so no real insight into the heap. And also the penalty for crashing the network card is relatively low, as it has no functional or visual influence on the UPS. And the only effect is a few seconds of downtime on the network card web interface. So we chose to overflow the TS-DNS cache entry struct using our heap overflow. As you can see, it has all sorts of interesting fields. It has a list of addr-info structs. Addr-info holds the contents of DNS responses. So if you resolve an IP address, it will have the IP. If you resolve a name, it will have a name. All sorts of stuff like that. And other than that, it has other interesting pointers. You can see it's in a doubly linked list, always advantageous for exploitation. And it's referenced often in DNS response parsing logic, which is the logic we can trigger. So this struct was interesting for us. So assuming we can overflow this struct, what can we do with it? So for example, during CNAME record processing, you can see this bit of pseudocode. It will first take a pointer from the cache entry, the addr-info list PTR, and save it in a local variable. It will then expand the CNAME, allocate the CNAME we provided on the heap, and it will later put the pointer to that heap buffer into the address provided from DNS cache entry. So basically, if we can overflow the DNS addr-info PTR field of the cache entry, we can, with some arbitrary value, we can write a pointer to some address in the address space. So a controlled pointer write. Pointers in 16-bit real mode are made, absolute pointers are made of 2 bytes offset and 2 byte segment. And we can write them to any alphanumeric address, since our overflow is alphanumeric. And this is a strong exploitation primitive. Writing data to places you're not supposed to write to is always interesting from an exploiter point of view. So we chose to go ahead with this primitive. Our overflow is a simple heap overflow. It's from the end of the MX name buffer with no jumps. It's a contiguous overflow. So in order to overflow the DNS cache entry, we need it to be placed linearly after us. This can prove a bit tricky since the DNS cache entry is allocated on DNS request creation, and our MX name buffer is obviously allocated on response parsing, which happens chronologically later. And we need the cache entry to be placed after our name buffer. So we need to do some shaping to make this happen. Luckily, this heap is a bit sophisticated, and it supports tight fit preference, meaning that if you have a hole of a specific size, as shown in this diagram, it will prefer to take the tightest fit for the allocation size requested from all the free blocks. So if we create, for example, a hole pattern that has a hole the size of the DNS cache entry struct after a hole the size of the MX name buffer we're going to allocate, it can assist us in reaching the linear overflow target. However, we do need to separate these holes with some allocated separator of some sort to prevent free block coalescing. So we'll use the memory leak artifact Moshe talked about to create the separators, and simple name DNS name allocation to create the names, as they are freed after DNS response parsing is finished, and we have 3 responses. So the limitations on our CNAME pointer write are the CNAME pointer is written to an address we overflowed into the cache entry, so it must be alphanumeric. This is a little NDN architecture, so the offset and segment will look like that. And since our overflow is, after all, a string overflow, we do have a trailing null byte, which can be used as the segment most significant byte, allowing us a bit more flexibility in what we can overflow. However, nothing interesting is placed in a strictly alphanumeric address. So no code, no heap, no stack, no globals, nothing interesting really. Luckily, because of the weird segmentation feature of this processor, we can easily combine 2 alphanumeric bytes to reach a non-alphanumeric byte. So that will look something like this. If we have a valid segment that we can overflow, such as null byte 4b, and we add to it an alphanumeric offset, such as AA, the result will contain a non-alphanumeric byte corresponding directly to a non-alphanumeric segment. This is possible due to the fact that the shift is by 8 bits and not 4 bits, giving us more flexibility in this calculation. And using this technique, we can reach the heap utility functions text section, allowing us to directly overwrite with our pointer heap code. Again, no mitigation, so no dep, no SLR. So when you can overwrite code with a pointer, one of the interesting things to do in x86 is to overwrite a file call destination, as it is encoded directly with an absolute pointer in it. So if we can overwrite a file call like this in some heap flow, we can cause the file call to direct execution to our CNAME buffer instead of the original destination. We chose, in our example, to patch a file call in a free error flow called when heap metadata corruption is detected. So when the metadata corruption is detected, the file call will execute our payload. So just to recap the vulnerability, we shape the heap to allow the MX name buffer to be placed before the DNS cache entry. We then overflow the DNSE adder info PTR, so it will point into some heap code, specifically a file call. Then a CNAME record we provided is processed, and the name and the R data of the CNAME is allocated on the heap. In this case, it will be some evil payload, so some alphanumeric shellcode of some sort. Then the pointer to that buffer will be placed into the pointer we overflowed on the cache entry struct, essentially overriding the file call destination in the free error flow, redirecting execution to the evil payload. So to trigger this error flow will be triggered when we free the MX name we overflowed from. Since we overflowed the end of it, some metadata was corrupted, and when it will be freed, our code will get executed. Our payload contains a 2-stage decoder to allow us to run arbitrary payloads and not be contained only to alphanumeric shellcodes. And in the demo you'll see soon, we execute a payload, turning off power to the UPS power outlets, essentially turning off any device connected to it. achieving arbitrary payload execution, and owning the device. So let's see a short demo.
Yes. Stop.
Hi everyone, thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us. We're here to take any questions you have about what you've just seen. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. All the speakers are here. I'm Shlomi, and Ariel and Moshe are here with me.
Hi. So we have a question from Ronald.
I see someone asked about finding these vulnerabilities. They were all found manually by reverse engineering. We had to reverse engineer several different devices to get a handle on the variances in the Treck stack, the different variations of what the vulnerabilities look like. But everything was done manually, and then some bin diff and only basic tools, Gibra, some IDA. Some hacked IDA modules to support architectures.
Maybe we have another one. No, these are source code. Okay. So John is asking if we had source code for our research.
Yeah. So.
So yeah, the answer is no. We did our research by reverse engineering several devices, and what you saw on the slides are pseudocode, essentially decompilation.
What we did have is we had pretty good debug symbols. The stack being in so many different devices, different vendors compile them differently. So some of the vendors compiled them with quite a few debug symbols, and that was, of course, very helpful.
Okay. We have a question. What effect will Ripple20 have on the defense industries?
So that's a pretty good question. It's a question that we're to some extent asking ourselves, because of course it's quite difficult to get reliable information in this case. We can say that we do know of at least a few defense contractors from different countries that are affected, and also that the Green Hills Integrity Operating System is to some extent affected, and it's used heavily in the defense sector. So the defense sector is affected, but of course the whole the risk model is different there. The risks are different, and the flow of information is very difficult.
Okay, we have another question from Cameron. Was there a response from APC or Schneider?
So Schneider were very responsive. And we're very communicative, and they've released patches for the APC devices as well as their other devices. And at this point, if you apply patches, all the APC devices are not affected by these vulnerabilities if you apply the patches.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Brent is asking, what are the top vendors that you think are most important that people should worry about patching, like common HP printers? I think HP printers should be patched.
Yeah, so I think it very much depends on your industry and your, the assets on your network, as well as the pattern.